Friends of the Infinite, welcome Chapter 8 of REN-SHEN Half Spirit Vibrations. Time passed quickly. Steve had already been teaching Goju-Ryu in Shinjuku for almost 3 years. He had learned his way around Tokyo as if he were a local. He spoke like a local and could even identify dialects in the region with an ability to slip into the Shitamachi dialect if he wanted to sound like an honest local working class man, and the Yamanoti dialect when he wanted to be more formal and sound more educated. He'd made many friends all over Tokyo. The most challenging aspect of his job was to try and accommodate all the invitations to social events organised by his students. Occasionally, Uncle Taki would need to return to Okinawa. He had business matters and a property there which required attention. He would leave the dojo entirely under Steve's control, and nobody ever doubted Steve's authority. Such was Steve's nature that the students looked up to him as if he were much older than his actual 21 years. Students would come to him for advice and motivation. Sometimes they would talk about problems at their jobs or schools, and Steve would offer suggestions based on parallels he could relate to his training. One incident that made him laugh when a student told Steve, "I hope I'll be as confident and wise as you when I reach your age." In fact, the student was older than Steve, but he didn't have the heart to tell him. Even Uncle Taki couldn't help but be motivated by Steve's infectious ability to inspire his classes. Very soon after Steve had joined him, he had reduced his alcohol intake to weekends only and trained vigorously with Steve after the evening classes. His skills always surprised Steve. There were some unique traits he saw in Uncle Taki. Steve could see Uncle Taki was speaking the language of Goju-Ryu, but he still managed to introduce his own personality and flair to their martial art. While Sensei Mike was powerful and far-reaching with his moves, Uncle Taki was shorter and used his low center of gravity and body weight to move in very close and try to send Steve off balance. In fact, Steve was grateful to train with Uncle Taki. He gave him another insight into the broadness of their martial art, and it only strengthened his desire to train under Sensei Mike and Uncle Taki's sensei in Okinawa. Megumi had also been training hard. What started as simply a desire to constantly be near Steve also soon became an addiction for her. She would look forward to training with Steve, and with her new training partner, Tanya. She was a beautiful American girl and had an ebullient personality which Megumi found utterly refreshing. Tanya worked in any job she could find. She was desperate to stay in Japan and found herself working in one of the dance clubs in Kabukicho as a hostess. Both Megumi and Steve were worried about her. That kind of work placed her in a world where the Yakuza are heavily involved, and once tangled in their webs, it was impossibly difficult to break free. Megumi was trying to teach her as much formal Japanese as possible so that she might find work outside of the seedy clubs. Tanya didn't seem to mind either way. She was making money and she had debts to pay. It was expensive living in Japan, and she found work where she would be paid to dance, and sometimes she would earn even more just by sitting and talking with older Japanese men who frequented the clubs. Meanwhile, Steve and Megumi's relationship had only strengthened over the years. Whatever they had missed out on in their youth, they found in each other. It was the deepest love. Reliance and joy they shared. Steve had made his choice the first time he met her. Megumi would be his wife, and it was only a matter of time before that became a reality. Both of them were deeply committed to each other and were eager to be married. There was little fanfare about the proposal. They both simply needed to express themselves as a single unit, and being married formally was something they both wanted. Steve would have liked to give Megumi his mother's engagement ring, which was back home in Australia. When he left Australia, he didn't think he would find the love of his life and marry her in a foreign land. He thought he might train in Okinawa for a year and then return to study in Australia, but instead he found joy and a life he could never have imagined in Japan. His beautiful Megumi was the air that he breathed and needed. Megumi explained to Steve that marriage in Japan was a relatively simple administrative process, and they had all the paperwork needed to have their marriage formally registered. Steve found it a little peculiar. He was more accustomed to Macedonian Orthodox wedding ceremonies, which were steeped in rituals and traditions. He wanted to honour his parents and have a marriage ceremony conducted under the Orthodox faith. But he was also mindful of Megumi's culture. He asked if she had any desire to consider a Shinto or Buddhist ceremony. She said, "Oh, my father would die a million deaths if we married under the Buddhist traditions. And I'm more than happy to follow your culture and beliefs. Besides, you know more about my culture than I know about yours. I would very much like to be married in your faith and tradition." Steve wasn't particularly sure what his faith actually was, but he did want to honour the memory of his parents and was eager to preserve their traditions. There were no Macedonian churches to be found in Japan, but he learned the Russian Orthodox Church had maintained a presence in Japan over the last 100 years, and it was quite easy to find a parish nearby. Steve went alone to the church to meet the priest and discuss arrangements for the wedding ceremony. He walked in and a flood of memories came back to him. The candles everywhere, the architecture and symbols immediately transported him back to his father's funeral. The icons on the walls with their old church Slavonic texts. Steve's father would correct him and call them Old Macedonian. He said the name was more appropriate. After all, it was the Macedonian saints, Kirill and Methody, who created the written language, he would always say. Steve purchased 3 candles. He lit each one individually for a different purpose. The first candle was for his mother. He lit the candle and placed it in the lower receptacle where souls of the dead are prayed for. He prayed she was happy and at peace. He did the same for his father and tried to rid his mind of the very vivid events which led to his death. He finally lit a candle for himself and Megumi and placed it in the higher receptacle so they would be blessed. The flame extinguished and Steve had to persist to keep it alight. He thought to himself, no way, there's nothing's going to interfere with our flame. The priest was mid-ceremony at the time. He was performing a liturgy and was a Japanese man with a Russian name performing rituals which were familiar to Steve. As odd as it all seemed, it was strangely comforting. Steve made the sign of the Orthodox cross with his right hand and then took a seat alone at the back of the church. He sat silently for a few minutes and then noticed someone sitting right next to him. It was an older Japanese woman. She looked extremely dignified and was dressed immaculately. Steve had been with Megumi long enough to finally be able to notice when a woman was wearing expensive clothing. Steve was enjoying his solitude and felt a little annoyed the woman would choose to sit right next to him, of all places. She then startled him as she spoke in Macedonian. She spoke in his own family's southern Macedonian dialect and asked, "Have you been to this church before?" Before Steve could even answer, the woman spoke in Japanese and said, "I hope you haven't forgotten me already, my king." As she turned to face Steve, he noticed her half mask and quickly realised the woman was Temyana. She wasn't that little girl who encouraged him at the tournament so long ago. She was now an elegant-looking middle-aged Japanese woman. The Temyan, the incense, Steve thought to himself. "That's right, my king," she said as if reading his mind. "It's easier to show myself to you where there is smoke, especially when it looks towards a god." Steve said, "I started to think you were in my imagination. Maybe you and I are in a dream or perhaps even a nightmare right now." She smiled and swiftly transformed into the little girl he remembered. "How could this little girl ever be a nightmare for you?" she joked. She then transformed back into the Japanese woman again and said, "My king, Australia was much safer than this country. This land is old and has worshipped many gods and been ruled by many demons. Surely you sense them. I've been watching you. Your power is growing and your enemies, those who fear the purity of your heart, are becoming aware of your presence. They cannot understand you. You are of a different world to them, but they feel your energy and they abhor it. My king, please leave this place. Go back to Australia and give yourself time to grow. These are dangerous times. The world is realigning itself once more and I fear the darkness will ascend again." Steve said, "Temyana, I came to this church to make arrangements for my marriage to the woman I love." Temyana interrupted. "Just like your ancestor Alexander when he married the Bactrian princess Roxana. Sure, he loved her desperately. Such a beautiful girl, too smart for her own good. But Alexander knew the favourable politics that would follow. He liked his princesses. You also want to marry a princess? I see. Does power excite, my king? A dangerous decision, my king. Your ancestor, the great Alexander, married Roxana and then died 4 years later after returning from India. Sure, he lost the desire for warring after India. When the great 10 were asked the 10 questions, he was forever changed. He'd finally found a way to become a god. And he passed to the next world earlier than expected. Such a shame. I wanted to be on that part of the journey with him. A combination or a battle of the divine always creates upheaval. It was lucky I helped his and Roxana's son, Alexander IV, escape, or you wouldn't be alive today, my king. Steve was catapulted back into the myths that Babbarada had told him and now had them corroborated by Temyana. He said, I didn't choose a princess. I chose the girl I love. That's all. There was no higher decision or agenda or attempt to make a new kingdom or politics or whatever. And how do you even know about her anyway? Temyana laughed. You knew the moment you saw her, didn't you? Something about her. She carries the divinity. It's like an enigma for the masses. They either fear or worship what they cannot understand. But you were like a moth to a flame with her. You had no choice. Did you think you had a choice? Of course you had a choice, my king. But I can see this is the path you've chosen, and all I can do is offer suggestions. My suggestion is to leave Japan immediately. You're not ready for the gods or demons here. They are the same, but they are different. You will die in a foreign land and be forgotten, the same as many of your ancestors in faraway places. You don't have to do this, my king. I shouldn't care, but I do. You are a special one. Every few generations, one stands out, and roughly every 1,000 years, someone amazing appears from your bloodline. The last one was the priest king, who forever changed Asia. I think you could be the next. Your powers came early. Perhaps it was your karate that quickened you. Or maybe it was the vibrations of the next world at that tournament. Once your body feels them, it can never be the same. I have an ancient covenant with your bloodline. It's my duty to assist you, no matter how I feel or wish. But if you die without any children, my covenant ends. I will guide you in your death so you can finally understand the real truth in death. And then, finally, we will both find our peace. Steve waved her away as if smoke was getting in his eyes, and she instantly disappeared. It was too much to digest. Did he really choose Megumi? Or was it some higher force propelling him towards her? He decided there was no higher force than love, and that was the only thing guiding him. Plain and simple, he said out loud, just as the priest had walked over to greet him. The priest asked him, I'm sorry, my son. What is plain and simple? Steve smiled and said, plain and simple is how love is the answer, and then introduced himself to the priest. The priest introduced himself as Father Dimitri. He warmed to Steve immediately and agreed emphatically with his statement about love. He was a short and slight Japanese man of remarkable intelligence. He spoke perfect Russian and could even read Old Macedonian. They chatted about their histories with the Orthodox Church, and both enjoyed the exchange. Steve was surprised the priest even knew about Macedonians. Thanks to his father, Steve was always proud of his ancestry and was extremely happy to hear the priest talk about the famous Macedonian brothers, Kirill and Methody, the saints who created the Glagolitic alphabet, the precursor to the Cyrillic alphabet, which is most commonly associated with the Russians. Steve thought to himself, Dad would have loved this. They finally turned their attention to the wedding ceremony and the significance of the rituals. How the crowns they planned to wear would symbolize the glory of sharing the kingship with God, and also to acknowledge the sacrifice of giving one's life to the other and together to Christ. Father Dimitri became lost in his own discussion. He then proceeded into esoteric discussions about theosis, where man can become God, or godlike through a process of purification, illumination and sainthood. It isn't easy, but it is real and it is our purpose, he said. He then discussed the importance of hesychasm and the ladder of divine ascent, and Steve's eyes seemed to glaze over. Too much, said a smiling Father Dimitri. I'm sorry, my son. I became a little excited and remembered my days on Mount Athos, or Svetogora as we would call it. My monastic life there was so fulfilling. I plan to go back there. Heavy stuff, but so interesting. Thank you very much for this discussion, Father, Steve said. He was indeed surprised by how fascinating the discussion had been. The notion of going through a number of processes to become God or godlike was such a bizarre and fanciful concept to grasp. Finally, a time was set for a wedding ceremony the following week, and they parted ways as though they'd been friends forever. Steve was well aware he would need a best man for the wedding, a very important person in the Orthodox faith, someone who would make sure Megumi and any of their children were safe if anything happened to him. There really was no better choice than Uncle Tucky, and it was a delight to see how he received the request. He was ecstatic and told Steve it would be his deepest honour. He wanted to learn everything about the ceremony in advance, but Steve assured him the priest would give instructions where necessary. Steve said, "Just don't drop the crowns at the wedding ceremony." Uncle Tucky laughed and said, "Oh, I see. A royal wedding, no less." Steve laughed and thought to himself, well, they mean a whole lot of other things in the Orthodox Church, but I can't say he's wrong. Megumi promptly decided she would ask Tanya to be her maid of honour. Their relationship was full of fun. Tanya's outgoing personality was such a pleasant departure from the girls she grew up with. She wasn't the least bit constrained by the Japanese cultural traditions developed over centuries, and she had such a magnetic and positive energy. Though it occurred to Megumi she seemed to be less effervescent than usual in recent times. Megumi asked Tanya if she would like to be her maid of honour at the wedding, and she was ecstatic. "Abso-fucking-lutely," Tanya said. Megumi laughed and blushed. She was still not used to hearing people swear. It always felt a little jarring, and she'd always overreact when trying to make it look as though she wasn't shocked. Tanya just laughed even louder, gave Megumi another hug and danced with her. She looked to be back to her old self, and it pleased Megumi to no end. Megumi asked Tanya, "My sweet crazy friend, please tell me, is everything okay with you?" Tanya's smile faded quickly, and in an exasperated look, she said, "A man keeps coming to the club. He's a rough and nasty guy. He calls himself Osamu, but everyone calls him Sammy Black Eyes. He threatens anyone who wants to come near me and keeps talking about taking me away with him back to his home in Okinawa. He's repulsive, and nobody will dare say a word to him. They all fear him. He's covered in tattoos and missing some fingers. I don't know what to do about him." Megumi said, "Please, just leave your work. I can get you a job at the hotel I work at. Let's go there now. I'll take you to meet my boss. Come with me now, Tanya." Tanya replied, "It's impossible, babe. I owe them too much money. They paid for my modelling portfolio and they paid off my gambling debts. Now I owe them and they own me. I don't think I'll ever make enough money to pay them back. They'll never let me go." Megumi was well aware of the practices of the animals in those clubs. Her father owned more than enough of the clubs and the people inside the clubs. She remembered seeing those evil men grovelling to her father as a child. They were the people who would lie, cheat and steal as naturally as breathing. It was normal practice to indebt someone in any way possible. What may have started as a simple exercise in learning how to play mahjong could easily turn into a gambling debt of life-ending proportions. Nothing was ever fair or left to chance about the process, and everything was stacked in the criminal's favour. Victims were nothing more than hosts, and the evil men were the cancer feeding on them until there was no more money or use for them. "And my father is the worst of them," she thought to herself as she trembled in contemplation. Tanya said, "Don't worry, babe, this will pass. Anyway, we got to make plans for your wedding. Oh my God, it's less than a week away." Megumi remained worried about her dear friend. Megumi decided she and Steve would find a way to help Tanya out of that wicked mess after they returned from their honeymoon in Kyoto. The days passed quickly as last-minute details were being attended to. Megumi had much to do and Steve was taking his students through some gradings. It was a busy time for everyone, but they were both very much looking forward to the coming Saturday. The night before the wedding, Tanya came crashing into the dojo. She was disoriented and crying, and her mouth was bleeding. She was calling for Megumi. She wasn't there, but Steve had just finished his evening class and quickly came to her attention. Tanya was clearly in pain and a state of shock. Steve flung a coat around her and tried to calm her. She wasn't making sense and was too distressed to talk. Steve decided to take her back to his apartment to see if Megumi could help settle her. Megumi was shocked and upset seeing her best friend in such a state. She immediately cleaned Tanya's face and tried everything in her power to soothe her. Tanya said Sammy Black Eyes grabbed her when she was talking to other club guests. He said, "Enough talking to them. Soon you will come to stay with me in Okinawa. You will pay back your debts to me." She told him he was being rude and he grabbed her by the throat and proceeded to choke her, then slapped her so hard that she fell unconscious to the ground. "After I came to, that bastard Sammy Black Eyes and all his men were laughing at me. I ran out of there and came straight here to find you, my sweet friend," Tanya said. Steve had heard enough and was livid. Steve's sense of justice and chivalry could not accept such behaviour. He didn't even bother to change out of his karate clothing. He charged out of the apartment and headed straight for Tanya's club in Kabukicho. Tanya and Megumi begged him not to go, but he was already out the door. Uncle Taki had quickly ushered the remaining students out of the dojo and was rushing to Steve and Megumi's nearby apartment. By the time he reached the apartment, Steve was already heading out. Uncle Taki quickly followed. It was obvious where Steve was going, and he was at pains to arrive at the best course of action. On one hand, Tanya was their student and friend, and she shouldn't have been treated this way. On the other hand, she entered a world where this treatment is normal practice, and a confrontation would invite consequences after the inevitable loss of face. Uncle Taki was double-stepping to keep up with Steve's pace. He said, "Steve, I know I cannot stop you from going, but please let me talk to them first." Uncle Taki thought he heard Steve say okay, but he wasn't completely sure. They reached the club in no time, and a security man attempted to halt Steve and Uncle Taki as they walked towards the entrance. Steve averted the man's attempt to grab him and flung him away as though he was flicking some trash away. They entered the darkness of the club. Music was playing loudly, and girls were on the stage dancing and parading around while men were drinking and ogling at them. Steve found a young lad collecting glasses and asked him to point out Sammy Black Eyes. Before the lad could even respond, they were surrounded by three men in suits who clearly were not there to welcome Steve and Uncle Taki. Steve could sense the danger. The vibrations Temyana was talking about in the church had grown markedly since they entered the club. Uncle Taki tried to diffuse the tension. He asked politely if it was possible to speak with Sammy Black Eyes. The men just glared at him, and then one started to laugh at Steve. He was pointing at his karate gi and laughing about the karate boy among his associates. They were all laughing, and one went to grab Steve's jacket. Steve intercepted his hand, twisted it, and at the same time swept away his feet from under him. As the man was falling, Steve grabbed him and picked him up as though he was a sack of rice, and slammed him on top of the bar. The sound of smashing glasses and bottles attracted everyone's attention. The other two advanced to attack Steve, but Uncle Taki moved forward in an exquisite and powerful move which managed to render one of them completely off balance, and he in turn fell on the other associate in such a way which also sent him off balance. Both were on the ground attempting to regain their composure when Steve felt the vibrations intensify. A man had joined them. He'd managed to stay out of the spotlights in the club and appeared a little more than a shadow when he said, "Lucky me. My little karateka friends are looking for me." He spoke to Uncle Taki in a raspy voice. "Taki-chan, why do you come here with your karate boy to make trouble?" Steve found no joy in being called a boy at all and started moving towards the shadow. Uncle Taki stepped in front of Steve and interjected. "It appears we have a friend who works here. Maybe she was mistreated by someone you know." Steve added, "There is no maybe. It was you. Leave her alone. She's not yours to treat like a dog." Uncle Taki was doing his best to keep Steve behind him and also trying to look calm. He was failing miserably. Sammy Black Eyes stepped out of the shadows. He was as tall as Steve with a similar sized frame. He looked like a 1950s rock and roller with his slick back hairstyle and long sideburns. His face was pockmarked, and he was wearing sunglasses even in the darkness of the club. He looked at Steve and smiled with a toothpick in his mouth. "You must be Steve's son. We know all about you. Isn't it time you go back to your little kangaroo land? Don't make a mistake and make me angry now. Fuck off out of here." Steve was agitated, and his body seemed to sense the danger in this man. The vibrations were strangely familiar to him. The last time he experienced them was when he fought that terrible monster who killed his father. Steve could feel his body involuntarily activate. Perhaps it was the adrenaline, he wasn't sure, but he was ready to fight him. Sammy Black Eyes leaned forward at Steve and lowered his sunglasses when he was only a few centimetres away from him. His eyes were all too familiar. They were indeed black. He didn't have black rings around his eyes. He had black eyeballs. He had seen them before. This was a monster or demon, and Steve knew all too well what kind of opponent he found in this creature. Sammy Black Eyes said, "The girl is mine. I own her. She can be free of me when she has paid what she owes me." Uncle Taki tried to diffuse the tension and asked, "If I may, please let me know how much she owes you. Perhaps we may be able to come to an arrangement." Sammy Black Eyes turned his gaze towards Uncle Taki and said, "You will not have the 7 million yen she owes me. You still live in your dojo. Why would you pay for her when you still don't have a real home? So sad how your previous home burned down." Steve abruptly interrupted the discussion. "You've cheated her out of money and now you want her to be your slave. It's not going to happen." Sammy Black Eyes said, "Listen, karate boy, your friend was a willing participant. There are always consequences, and she will pay one way or another. If you want to pay, it would be my pleasure to take your money. Do you need 2 girlfriends, karate boy? Is your Megumi not enough for you?" He disappeared into the shadows as Steve's rage peaked. Then Sammy's voice reverberated out of the club DJ's music system. "Just bring me the money, karate boy, and you can have her," as his wicked laughs echoed throughout the club. Uncle Taki managed to calm Steve and escort him out of the club. He said to Steve, "It was best for all that the confrontation did not escalate into a fight. We did not need this trouble the night before your wedding." Steve begrudgingly agreed as they were heading back to his apartment. Steve said the man was evil. You could feel it, right? There's no morality in monsters like that. They arrived at the apartment to the relief of Tanya and Megumi. They both looked relieved after seeing Steve and Uncle Taki were unharmed. Steve told Tanya that Sammy Black Eyes was looking for 7 million yen in order to release her. He asked if this was correct. Tanya was adamant it was 3 million yen and that some of that debt had been repaid with her time in the club. She was even more upset, and it was clear to everyone that there would be no solution found that evening. Steve promised Tanya they would find a way to resolve the problem and urged the girls to get some rest. Uncle Taki bid everyone good night and returned to his dojo. Megumi and Steve insisted Tanya stay with them that evening, and she slept on the couch. Steve spent all night thinking about that monster, Sammy Black Eyes, and how he was going to deal with him. The next day, Tanya was back to her chirpy self. She woke up Steve and Megumi to advise them her duties as maid of honour had already begun, and she'd made pancakes for the soon-to-be newlyweds. Steve wasn't completely prepared when Megumi had changed into her wedding dress. She was wearing a beautiful white dress which looked halfway between a traditional kimono and a Western-styled wedding dress. He'd never seen anything like it before, and was mesmerised with his soon-to-be wife again. Once everyone was ready, it was time for the bride, the groom, and maid of honour to make their way to the church, together with Uncle Taki. Upon entering the church, everyone except Steve looked as wide-eyed as he did when he first arrived in Japan. It was all completely foreign to them. They had never seen anything like it. Some of the icons were so graphic. One showed a man with a glowing halo spearing a king, and another with a halo was killing a dragon. Uncle Taki was clapping his hands and said, "I like this. These heroes are fighting like true warriors." Uncle Taki had bought a new camera specifically for the wedding and was furiously snapping away at all the icons and, of course, Megumi and Steve. Father Dimitri greeted them all warmly and welcomed them to his church. He proceeded to give them instructions, and with little fanfare, he advised the ceremony was about to begin. He lit some frankincense in his thurible and commenced the blessing of the rings. Temiana appeared in the smoke. Thankfully, she was wearing the half mask, Steve thought to himself as he looked at the tall blonde woman only 20 centimetres away from Megumi. She was inspecting her as though she was at the fish markets looking to buy the best tuna. She gave Megumi a wink, and he could have sworn Megumi smiled towards her direction. Temiana then smiled at Steve and gave him an approving nod. Steve had long given up wondering why she was invisible to almost everyone but him, but he began to wonder if Megumi could see her also. Soon enough, the crowning ceremony commenced. Father Dimitri placed the joined crowns upon the heads of Steve and Megumi. Immediately, Steve felt an energy rush of powerful vibrations through him. Megumi also seemed slightly overwhelmed as she corrected her standing position. Temiana immediately appeared next to Steve. She said, "Did you feel that? Oh, my Orpheus, you are linked with your princess, my king. Something very old joins your bloodlines. It's impossibly energetic. I cannot understand this, but I feel it. Old souls call out to this bond. Perhaps the priest king, Daruma. I don't know what to make of this, but it is powerful, my king, so powerful." Father Dimitri instructed Uncle Taki. He was clearly proud to be involved in such an important part of the ritual. He was swapping the crowns 3 times as a witness to the sealing of the union. Steve and Megumi drank wine from the common cup. Then they were led around the altar 3 times, and finally the crowns were removed with the traditional blessings from Father Dimitri. Steve and Megumi looked at each other, wondering at which point they were actually married. Perhaps they still weren't. Father Dimitri made it very clear they were most definitely married under the eyes of God, and suggested a kiss between the bride and groom was not unreasonable at that point. They kissed, and Tanya and Uncle Taki were clapping and ran in to hug them. It was a joyous moment. Steve noticed Temiana looking utterly perplexed. Lying down on one of the pews and talking to herself or the ceiling, he gave up trying to understand her and decided it was time to celebrate. He and his baby love were finally married. They went to the Shinjuku Gyoen National Gardens and took photographs and danced in the parklands. Later it was dinner at an extremely expensive restaurant where Steve half-jokingly asked for tuna and mayonnaise onigiri. They laughed all night and enjoyed Uncle Taki's impersonations of famous movie stars. It was the perfect day, and Steve and Megumi were deliriously happy. The next day, the couple were headed to Kyoto for a short honeymoon. Tanya's problem was not resolved, and it wasn't easy leaving her alone to fend for herself. Steve and Megumi insisted she stay in their apartment and implored Uncle Taki to check on her frequently. Tanya assured them she would be fine and said she wouldn't step out of the apartment until they returned. Uncle Taki promised he'd bring food to Tanya and make sure she was safe. Steve and Megumi were finally comfortable enough with the arrangements to leave for Kyoto. Brothers and sisters of the infinite, what magic, what sort of crazy stuff is happening now? We had Steve and Megumi finally married. They married in a Russian Orthodox church. The Orthodox Church in Russia had been there for about the early 1900s or late 1800s. Doing what they do, trying to buy more souls, to win more souls. And young Steve decided he wanted to honour his parents' memory, sought an Orthodox wedding, which was nice. We gained a sense of vibrations again. Temiana was found and she warned our dear man, Steve. She warned him of what's going on in this country. Japan is indeed an old nation. It's got old culture that just permeates every aspect of society there. So you're going to have demons. You're going to have thoughts about your soul. You're going to have thoughts about what happens to it. You're going to have thoughts about God in its various forms, in its various ways to interpret whatever God is to them, to us, to anybody. So being an old culture, there's a lot of different ideas and ideals, and Temiana warned him. She said, be careful, get out of here, it is dangerous. She mentioned the priest king, Daruma. We'll come back to that later, but she expressed a thing that his bloodline included the likes of Alexander the Great, and another big one in the long line of people in his bloodline was Daruma, which the priest king, which is kind of interesting. We'll find out a bit more about that. Anyway, they got married. That was great. But prior to that, we found Tanya. We met Tanya and we found out she had a problem. Tanya is real gung-ho American girl, beautiful girl. Went to Japan with all sorts of ideas in her head, but ended up locked away in a club owing a lot of money. Very common pursuit by the Yakuza. Stitch people up, make them owe a lot of money, keep them forever indebted, and then they just have to keep working for you. So we don't know if Tanya's in fact a prostitute, but she's in the very shady part of the world, and it's best we don't delve into that. But you know, clearly Tanya's compromised in her life, and perhaps didn't make all the best decisions. So let's hope things improve for Tanya. There's not a great deal to learn from this chapter. We did have a brief discussion with the priest, Father Dimitri, who talked about theosis, theosification, the hesychasm and the divine ladder of ascent. Early Christianity explored the idea, and it was kind of, I won't say abandoned, but it was played down. It wasn't quite the issue as much as what it used to be in the early stages of Christianity about how man can become God or godlike, but really God. And that in fact, everyone's purpose is to become God. And if you actually, follow the Bible, and read through it, there's constant reminders that we need to try and become. If you follow the New Testament, then you need to try and become like Jesus. And the more you become like Jesus, the more you're going to be a better person. And logically, if you can become exactly like Jesus, well, then you're a god, really, if you think about it. And so early Christianity focused on that notion and just said, right, well, surely that's all of our objectives, that we should try to become so good and so enlightened and so in touch with our souls that we become gods ourselves. So a very real concept that's not quite as prominent nowadays. Now, from Christianity's perspective, it's to love Jesus, and that's that. And it certainly was the case in the early Christian era, but there was also this subcontext there as well. And certainly more, in the territory of the mystics, the people who really explored the spiritual aspects. Often monks and the likes, and were the ones who were really getting into that sort of philosophy and study. So we might ponder that a bit more. But we had a wedding. They were married. Temyana could sense a powerful union. Clearly the blood of an empress. Gave a bit of a wink, said, this one's a bit of a hottie to Steve. She's all right. You did a good choice there. Look at her, she's beautiful. So, did Megumi recognize her? Could she see her? Who the hell knows? Don't know. Anyway, blood of an emperor, blood of a king, union. Surely it's all fantastic. This is an amazing union. There is never a doubt about that. Steve, Nedelkin, and Megumi. I got it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that chapter. That's chapter 8. We're on to chapter 9 next, obviously. I look forward to you participating. Thanks again. Please keep going, and don't be afraid to buy the book. It's much appreciated if you do. If you love these t-shirts, the significance in Chinese characters is human, man, and God. There's REN-SHEN. Then reach out to me. I'm sure we can work something out, depending on where you are, of course, but there's more than one way to do it. It's called the REN-SHEN Holy Motif, and it's becoming important to me. I quite like it. It's actually symbolic of this whole process, and I think all of us should try and find our inner God. We should try and find out what makes us strong and what makes us absolutely superhuman. That's our ideal. Shouldn't we all aim for that as well? Whether it's through training, whether it's through learning, whether it's through study, through experience, anything. Just find a way to further enlighten yourself. Find a way to elevate your consciousness. Otherwise, it becomes a very meaningless life. So there's my little attempt at philosophy, perhaps. But anyone who trains in martial arts hopefully realizes that you've trained your body. Surely you'd consider training your mind in the process. So hopefully we do elevate ourselves from our existing positions in life or stations in life. So it is our duty to become gods. What are you doing today about that? I don't know. I'm off to work. Well, thank you again. See you soon.